I want you to imagine, just for a moment, standing on the edge of a really steep, rugged riverbank, and you are looking up at this massive, towering wall of concrete.
Right, just this imposing, unnatural structure.
Exactly. I mean, this wall has been there for over 60 years. It has completely choked off a mighty ancient river, right? It transformed what used to be this wild, churning, oxygen-rich waterway into, well, a flat, artificially warm reservoir.
A completely stagnant ecosystem, basically.
Yeah. Now imagine the sheer logistical and, like, the physical violence it takes to tear that wall down. You know, the blasting caps, the heavy excavators biting into rebar, the years of bureaucratic planning that finally culminate in a cloud of dust and rushing water.
It is a phenomenal image to start with, because it frames the whole central conflict we are exploring today.
Right, because once a concrete is gone, the river is physically free to flow downhill for the first time in 3 generations. But the question that follows all that destruction is biological, like what happens the day after?
Yeah, how long does it actually take for the natural world to realize the barrier is gone?
Exactly. How long to remember what to do with that open water? And if you've ever wondered what happens when human engineering steps out of the way of ancient natural instincts, well, you're going to want to hear this.
You really are.
Right.
And we are looking at a collision of timelines here, because human engineering operates on a scale of decades.
Yeah.
You know, we build a dam in the 1960s, we tear it down in the 2020s, but natural biological instinct has been honed over millions of years.
Millions of years of evolution, yeah.
Right. And for this deep dive, we were relying on a very specific, verified dossier of government and agency reports to understand that collision. We are drawing from public domain data from NOAA Fisheries, the U.S. Geological Survey, and state wildlife departments in California and Oregon.
And we also have some really fresh data too, right?
We do, yeah. Crucially, we are analyzing preliminary scientific field data that was just released in late 2025. So we're looking at established facts alongside real-time, early-stage observations of a massive ongoing ecological event.
And the focal point of that event is the Klamath River Basin, where, I mean, we just witnessed the largest dam removal in United States history.
The largest ever, yeah. It's unprecedented.
It really is. And I went into these reports expecting, I don't know, a slow, cautious story of environmental healing. I assumed we would be talking about a few fish tentatively poking their noses past a former dam site after, like, 5 or 10 years.
That would be the standard expectation, sure.
Right. But the pace of what actually happened challenged literally every assumption I had.
The timeline of the Klamath Project fundamentally rewrites our expectations of ecological recovery. I mean, to contextualize the scale, 4 hydroelectric dams, J.C. Boyle, Copco 1, Copco 2, and Iron Gate, were all slated for removal.
For massive structures.
Yeah. And the physical drawdown of the reservoirs began early in 2024. Deconstruction ran through that spring and summer. By the late summer of 2024, the final structure, the Iron Gate Dam, was completely removed from the main stem of the river.
And that final breach, that single moment, reopened a continuous pathway to somewhere between 420 and 440 miles of historic, high-elevation river habitat.
Just staggering.
Over 400 miles of habitat locked behind concrete since, the Kennedy administration. And the restoration crews and biologists were preparing for this long, slow wait. But within days to weeks of that final concrete coming out, fall-run Chinook salmon were detected moving upstream.
Right past the old footprint of the dam.
Exactly. Directly past the old Iron Gate site. By early October 2024, the first fish were documented in that reach, and a few weeks later, they were spawning in Jenny Creek. But here's the thing I keep getting stuck on. No one physically relocated these fish.
No, not a single one.
They weren't put in a truck and driven up there. They did this on their own. Okay, let's unpack this, because how does a salmon whose parents, grandparents, and great-great-grandparents lived their entire lives cut off from this water suddenly know it's there?
It's a great question.
I mean, what is the actual mechanism driving a fish to swim into a place its genetic line hasn't seen in 60 years? It's like a freeway off-ramp that's been closed for 3 generations, suddenly reopening, and the cars immediately know to take it.
That's perfect analogy. And the mechanism there is a fascinating blend of extreme sensory adaptation and, well, a built-in biological failsafe called straying.
Straying.
Yeah. So to understand how they knew the water was there, we have to look at their olfactory system. Salmon possess an incredibly acute sense of smell. When they are juveniles, hatching in the river gravel and making their way out to the Pacific, they go through olfactory imprinting.
So they are like smelling the water as they swim down?
They are literally memorizing the highly specific chemical signature of their home stream. They log the unique blend of dissolved minerals, soil types, surrounding vegetation, even the specific amino acids released by other organisms in that water.
Wow, so they are building a chemical map of the river in their brains as they head to the ocean.
They are. And when they reach maturity out in the Pacific, that physiological drive to spawn kicks in. They use that chemical map to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean back to the exact mouth of their home river and up to the very gravel beds where they were born.
That is wild. But if they only go back to where they were born, how did they find the newly opened water on the Klamath? They weren't born up there.
Right, and that's where evolution provides a survival mechanism. If an entire species only ever returned to one hyper-specific location, a single localized disaster, like a landslide or a volcanic eruption, could wipe out the entire genetic line.
Oh, that makes sense. You'd lose the whole run.
Exactly. To prevent this, a small percentage of every returning salmon population is genetically wired to stray. They do not return to their birth stream. Instead, they actively seek out new, unoccupied, but chemically suitable habitats.
Because when Iron Gate came down, this massive plume of cold, fresh water from the upper Klamath Basin suddenly rushed down into the lower river. It completely altered the chemical signature of the main stem, didn't it?
Overnight. The scent of the river changed overnight. For decades, the lower river smelled only of stagnant, algae-heavy water spilling over the top of the reservoir.
Just warm, gross water.
Yeah. But the moment the dams breached, the lower river was flooded with the olfactory cues of hundreds of miles of pristine, high-elevation, oxygen-rich habitat. When the pioneering strays from the fall 2024 run hit that newly mixed water, their physiological drive pushed them to follow the coldest, most oxygenated current.
So they were just blindly navigating against the flow, driven entirely by this ancient instinct, pushing into the newly accessible water until they found gravel of the right diameter to dig their nests, the reds.
That's exactly what happened.
But wait, how do they survive that journey physically? You mentioned they go from the river to the ocean and back. If you take a standard freshwater fish and drop it in the ocean, it dies, right? The salt draws all the water out of its cells.
It does. It's a massive biological hurdle.
So how are these salmon physically managing the transition between the Pacific Ocean and these newly opened mountain streams without their biology just, shutting down?
Well, that touches on a trait called being anadromous, and it involves a biological marvel known as osmoregulation. A salmon has to fundamentally alter the function of its kidneys and its gills to survive the transition.
Wait, they change how their kidneys work?
Entirely. In freshwater, a fish is constantly absorbing water through its skin and gills, so its kidneys work overtime to produce copious amounts of dilute urine to pump the excess water out.
Okay, keeping the balance.
Right. And meanwhile, specialized chloride cells in the gills actively pump salt into the blood to maintain salinity.
And when they hit the ocean, they have to reverse that entire system.
The entire system flips. In the ocean, the surrounding water is saltier than the fish's blood, meaning the ocean is constantly trying to dehydrate the fish.
So they start losing water.
Yeah, so the salmon starts drinking seawater aggressively. Its kidneys drastically reduce urine production to conserve internal water. And those specialized chloride cells in the gills, they reverse their polarity.
You're kidding.
No, instead of pumping salt in, they begin actively excreting the massive amounts of salt the fish is swallowing. So when these adult salmon return to the Klamath and hit the freshwater plume from the removed dams, their bodies undergo this massive, exhausting physiological reversal all over again.
And they are doing all this while utilizing their fat reserves to power their swimming muscles because, adult salmon stop eating entirely once they enter freshwater to spawn.
They starve themselves, yes.
Yeah.
It's a one-way trip.
That makes the speed of this recolonization even more staggering. They are undergoing massive organ failure, starving, navigating by smell, yet they colonize the upper river in weeks.
It is a testament to the resilience of the species.
But that brings up a massive logistical question for me. In the fall of 2024, the river was likely a chaotic mess of sediment and debris from the demolition.
Oh, extremely turbid, very muddy.
So how on earth were scientists monitoring these fish so quickly? A traditional optical underwater camera in a muddy, churning river wouldn't see an inch past the lens.
No, standard video feeds are completely useless when the water looks like chocolate milk. To solve this, a massive coalition was formed. This involved over 19 organizations.
Wow, 19.
Yeah, you had tribal partners leading the charge, the Karuk tribe, the Yurok tribe, and the Klamath tribes. They have managed these resources for millennia, and they worked alongside conservation groups like Caltrout, state agencies like the California and Oregon Departments of Fish and Wildlife, and federal
It's
bodies.
just a huge effort.
Exactly. And to actually see the fish, they deployed technology from the Fisheye Project, which is a collaboration involving researchers from Caltech, MIT, and UMass.
I read about the fisheye project in the dossier, and I mean, the technology feels like it belongs on a military submarine, not a mountain creek. If they can't use light to see the fish, they use sound, right?
They rely on acoustic cameras, essentially high-frequency sonar. Instead of capturing photons of light, an acoustic camera emits rapid pulses of high-frequency sound waves into the water column.
Okay.
When those sound waves hit an object of a different density than the water, like the air-filled swim bladder of a Chinook salmon or its dense skeletal structure, the sound bounces back to the receiver.
It's basically the exact same principle as a bat, using echolocation to find a moth in the dark, but translated into a visual heat map on a screen.
A very precise analogy, yes. The acoustic camera processes those return echoes to create high-resolution, video-like imagery of the riverbed and anything moving through it, regardless of how muddy or dark the water is.
That's incredible.
It is, but that creates a secondary problem. An acoustic camera running 24 hours a day generates an insurmountable amount of data.
Oh, right. You just have endless footage.
Right, you would need a team of biologists doing nothing but staring at grainy sonar footage for months just to manually count the fish.
Which is where the artificial intelligence comes in. How did they train an AI to know what it's looking at? Because honestly, a sonar return of a fish probably looks a lot like a sonar return of a waterlogged branch floating down the river.
Dr. Michael Hobley and the Fisheye team approached this using machine learning. They took thousands of hours of historical acoustic camera footage where humans had already manually identified and placed bounding boxes around different objects.
So they fed it the answers first.
Exactly. They fed this annotated data into an algorithm, teaching it to recognize the specific undulating swimming motion and the elongated shape of a salmonid versus the rigid passive drift of a log or, the erratic movement of a smaller resident fish.
And it worked.
It did. By the time the Klamath dams came down, the AI model was sophisticated enough to analyze the live sonar feed in real time. It could instantly detect a target, classify it as a large anadromous fish, estimate its length, and log the time of passage, alerting monitors like Damon Goodman and James Whelan of Caltrout immediately.
That fusion of tech and ancient instinct is brilliant. And that is how we know they arrived in weeks. But the dossier moves forward from that initial shock in late 2024 to the preliminary data collected a full year later, right, in the late fall and winter of 2025.
Right, transitioning into the one-year benchmark.
Yeah, and this is where the narrative shifts from a handful of pioneering strays to a basin-wide biological resurgence. The quote from Michael Harris at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is striking. He reported, and I quote, "There are salmon everywhere on the landscape right now."
And the 2025 preliminary figures quantify that statement dramatically. During that monitoring window, over 10,000 large fish measuring over 2 feet in length and overwhelmingly identified as Chinook salmon passed the former footprint of the Iron Gate Dam.
Over 10,000.
Yeah, and comparing that to the baseline data from the previous year, before the final barrier was entirely cleared, that represents roughly a 30% increase in passage.
And they didn't just cross the finish line of the old dam and stop, either. The geographic spread of this 2025 run is incredible. Biologists documented fish more than 360 river miles inland from the Pacific Ocean.
That's a massive push into the interior.
They were actively spawning in tributaries of Upper Klamath Lake, specifically the Wood, Williamson, and Sprague rivers.
The geography there is crucial to understand the magnitude of this. Upper Klamath Lake is a massive, shallow, high desert lake in Oregon. Its tributaries stretch deep into the Cascade Range.
Way up high.
Yeah, and those specific rivers, the Wood, the Williamson, the Sprague, provide vast networks of cold, spring-fed spawning gravel. But they had been inaccessible to migratory fish for over a century, predating even the major hydroelectric dams due to early irrigation diversions.
Over a century. So seeing a Chinook salmon cutting a red in those upper tributaries is the realization of a century of deferred ecological potential?
It truly is. The human reaction to seeing those fish must have been profound.
Oh, absolutely. But the data shows the fish aren't just showing up, they are successfully reproducing. The Fall Creek Fish Hatchery, which is operated by the state of California, sits on a tributary that was previously blocked.
Right, a newly accessible tributary.
Exactly. And during the fall of 2025, Hatchery workers collected approximately 1.27 million eggs from returning adult salmon. That is 4 times the volume they collected the year prior.
4 times the volume. That's a massive reproductive leap.
Furthermore, field crews conducting basin-wide sampling documented a run composition heavily dominated by Chinook, and they counted tens of thousands of wild, naturally produced juvenile Chinook in Fall Creek.
What's fascinating here is that the presence of those wild juveniles is the ultimate metric of success. It proves that the adult salmon didn't just migrate and die, they successfully spawned in the newly opened habitat, their eggs survived the incubation period in the gravel, and the resulting fry emerged healthy.
They actually survived.
Yes. But to understand why they are surviving so well, we have to look beyond the simple removal of a concrete wall. Dams do not just block fish. They fundamentally alter the physical and chemical nature of the water itself.
Yeah, let's unpack the water chemistry. Because a reservoir isn't just a wide spot in the river, it acts like a giant stagnant bathtub.
The bathtub effect is arguably the most destructive element of a dammed river system in the Pacific Northwest. When a river flows naturally, it is shallow, moving constantly, tumbling over rocks, and mixing with atmospheric oxygen.
Just a dynamic, moving system.
Right. But when you back that river up behind a dam, you create a deep, still reservoir. In the summer heat of Northern California and Southern Oregon, the surface layer of that reservoir absorbs massive amounts of solar radiation.
It just bakes in the sun.
Exactly. The water thermally stratifies, meaning the warm water stays on top, and the cold water sinks to the bottom.
And when the dam releases water downstream to generate power, it is often spilling that hot, sun-baked surface water into the lower river, which is disastrous for an animal like a salmon that requires cold water to function.
Precisely the issue. Salmon physiology begins to break down when water temperatures exceed roughly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. They become lethargic, their immune systems crash, and they become highly susceptible to disease.
So they're just swimming into a wall of hot water.
Yeah. But when the Klamath dams were removed, those giant thermal sinks were eliminated. The river returned to a natural temperature profile. The 2025 data show that in the fall, when adult salmon are returning from the ocean and require cold water for the massive exertion of spawning, the water at the former Iron Gate site reached the crucial threshold of 50 degrees Fahrenheit a full month earlier than it did in the baseline years.
A full month earlier, the river cools down much faster in the fall. And on the flip side, without that massive, deep volume of water acting as a cold sink during the winter, the free-flowing river actually warms up a little bit faster in the spring, right?
It does. And that spring warming is equally vital. Juvenile salmon, the fry and smolts, rely on environmental cues, specifically water temperature and flow volume, to trigger their outmigration to the ocean.
It tells them when to leave.
Exactly. When the spring water warms up slightly sooner and more naturally, the juveniles grow faster. They metabolize their food more efficiently, reach their smolt stage earlier, and begin their journey to the ocean sooner.
And getting to the ocean sooner is critical because it shrinks their exposure window to one of the most terrifying threats in the river system. Because if we are talking about biological marvels, we have to talk about the villains too. The dams didn't just warm the water, they inadvertently engineered the perfect breeding ground for a parasite.
Ah, yes. The pathogen you were referring to is a mexozoan parasite called Ceratodonova shasta, or C. shasta. It is a microscopic organism that has absolutely devastated juvenile salmon populations in the Klamath Basin for decades.
Decimated them.
Yeah. And the biology of this parasite is incredibly complex because it requires an intermediate host to complete its life cycle. It cannot just spread from salmon to salmon.
It needs a very specific environment to thrive. How does the life cycle of C. shasta actually work?
Well, the parasite relies on a tiny, freshwater polychaetid worm that lives in the sediment of the riverbed. When an infected adult salmon dies after spawning, it releases millions of myxospores into the water. These spores sink into the sediment and are ingested by the polychaetid worm.
So the worms eat the spores.
Right. And inside the worm, the parasite undergoes a transformation and multiplies. The worm then releases a different spore stage, called an actinosporion, into the water column.
Just floating down the river.
Exactly. And when a juvenile salmon swims through a cloud of these actinosporions, the spores physically attach to the fish's gills or skin, inject their genetic material, and migrate to the fish's intestine, causing severe necrosis and massive mortality.
It literally rots their intestines out. And the reservoirs were supercharging this cycle.
The reservoirs created the ultimate incubator for C. shasta. The slack water behind the dams allowed nutrient-rich fine sediment to settle to the bottom, creating massive, stable colonies of the polychaete worms.
Because the water wasn't moving to wash them away.
Right. Furthermore, the warm water spilling out of the reservoirs acted as an accelerant for the parasite, vastly increasing the rate at which the worms released spores. You had juvenile salmon swimming downstream, encountering a wall of warm water and swimming through dense, inescapable clouds of infectious spores.
Just total death trap. But when you remove the dam, you drain the bathtub. You bring back the cold, fast, tumbling water.
And that physical alteration of the flow disrupts every stage of the parasite's life cycle. The fast, scouring currents of the free-flowing river physically tear up the fine sediment beds, dispersing the polychaete worm colonies.
It just washes the habitat away.
Exactly. And the cooler water temperatures significantly slow the replication rate of the parasite within the remaining worms. And as we discussed, the natural temperature profile encourages the juvenile salmon to outmigrate earlier in the spring, effectively moving them past the danger zones before the water gets warm enough to trigger massive spore releases.
So they beat the clock, basically.
They do. The preliminary 2025 data strongly indicated a marked decrease in the prevalence of C. shasta infections among outmigrating juveniles.
It is stunning how pulling one lever, removing a concrete wall, and the survival of a fish species. And we haven't even touched on the sediment yet. The river is moving sand and gravel again.
Sediment transport is the lifeblood of a river ecosystem. For 60 years, the dams acted as massive sediment traps. All the sand, silt, and gravel washing down from the Cascade Mountains hit the still water of the reservoirs and sank to the bottom.
It never made it downstream.
No. So the river below the dams became sediment-starved. The fast water stripped the lower river of its gravel, leaving only large cobbles and bedrock, which are entirely useless for a salmon trying to dig a nest.
Because they need specific walnut to baseball size gravel that water can flow through to oxygenate their eggs, right?
Exactly the size they require. But the removal of the dams reestablished the river's competence, its ability to naturally transport and sort various sizes of sediment downstream. The river is actively rebuilding its own channel complexity, creating the gravel bars and deep pools required for spawning and rearing.
And it wasn't just left entirely to nature either, was it?
No, this natural physical recovery was heavily augmented by direct human effort. Roughly $28 million was invested in massive revegetation projects, planting millions of native seeds and trees along the exposed reservoir footprints to stabilize the banks and provide future shade and large woody debris for the river.
So we are looking at these incredible numbers, the 10,000 fish, the 360 miles of inland travel, the disruption of the parasite, the rebuilding of the gravel beds. But the biologists in the dossier are waving a massive cautionary flag. We have to ground ourselves in the reality of what this data actually represents.
We do. The critical caveat is that these are first-year preliminary findings. They represent a spectacularly successful opening chapter, but they do not guarantee the end of the story. Establishing a genuinely recovered, self-sustaining population of wild salmon will require decades of continuous monitoring.
Decades.
Yes, because the survival of andromous fish is dictated by a vastly complex matrix of variables far beyond the river mouth.
Because they spend years in the ocean. The river can be perfect, but if the ocean is hostile, the run collapses anyway, right?
The marine environment is the great wild card. Variables such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, deep sea temperature anomalies like the blob that devastate the marine food web, ocean acidification, commercial bycatch, and prolonged regional droughts affecting freshwater flows. All of these factors will exert massive pressure on the Klamath salmon in the coming years.
It's just a gauntlet out there.
It really is. One strong return provides proof of concept for dam removal, but the long-term experiment has just begun.
And it is an experiment that requires constant funding to track. There were some significant wobbles in federal science funding during this specific monitoring window. Private foundations had to rapidly step in and backfill the budgets just to keep the acoustic cameras running and the biologists in the field.
Yeah, science funding can be incredibly volatile.
Definitely. And if you are curious about the intricate, sometimes brutal politics of federal science funding, I highly recommend checking out our storm warning deep dive, which breaks that situation down entirely. But for this discussion, the overarching takeaway is undeniable.
Let's see.
The Klamath River answered our question. The biology works, and it works incredibly fast. But to prove this isn't just a localized fluke, a temporary surge, we need to look at a river that has had time to settle into its new reality. We need a long-term benchmark.
For that long-term benchmark, The scientific community looks to the Elwha River, situated on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, largely within Olympic National Park. The Elwha provides more than a decade of rigorous, peer-reviewed post-removal data that validates the rapid biological responses we are currently observing on the Klamath.
The Elwha project was the previous record holder for dam removal. Between 2011 and 2014, work crews took down two massive structures, the Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam. Bringing those down reopened over 70 miles of some of the most pristine, protected river habitat in the country.
Incredibly vital habitat.
And the timeline of recovery there mirrors the shock of the Klamath, doesn't it?
It does. Within roughly 2.5 years of the final demolition, biologists documented 8 distinct species of anadromous fish naturally recolonizing the upper reaches of the river, pushing miles above the former dam sites.
8 species. That's a huge diversity.
It is. This recolonization included multiple species of Pacific salmon, chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum, alongside winter and summer runs of steelhead and native bull trout.
But the dossier highlights one specific species returning to the Elwha that isn't a salmon or a trout, and I found the cultural notes on it incredibly poignant. Let's look at the Pacific lamprey. We build these massive narratives around the majestic leaping salmon, but the return of the lamprey is ecologically and culturally massive.
The Pacific lamprey is a fascinating creature, often entirely overlooked in mainstream ecological discussions. They are an ancient lineage of jawless fish, predating the dinosaurs.
Predating the dinosaurs, wow.
Yeah, they look somewhat like eels, possessing a cartilaginous skeleton and a suction cup mouth lined with sharp teeth. Like salmon, they are anadromous. They're born in freshwater, spend years as blind filter-feeding larvae called amocoids buried in the river mud, migrate to the ocean where they become parasitic feeders attached to larger marine life, and eventually return to the rivers to spawn and die.
They sound like something out of a horror movie, to be honest. But their ecological role is vital, right? They bring marine nutrients back to the river just like salmon do.
They deliver massive amounts of marine-derived nutrients to the freshwater ecosystem. Because they are incredibly fat-rich and relatively slow swimmers without scales, they are a primary, highly caloric food source for predators.
So they get eaten instead of the salmon.
Exactly. They act as a crucial buffer that reduces predation pressure on juvenile salmon. But their significance extends far beyond biology. For the indigenous tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific lamprey is profoundly central to their diet, their medicinal practices, and their ceremonial life.
It's a foundational part of their culture.
It is. The dams decimated the lamprey populations, just as ruthlessly as the salmon. Watching naturally produced lamprey navigate past the old Elwha dam sites and successfully reproduce in the upper basin represents a profound dual victory. It's a deep ecological restoration, but it is also the restoration of an ancient cultural inheritance.
That is just beautiful. I want to shift our perspective on the river for a moment, though. We spend all our energy marveling at the fish pushing up the river against the current. But what about what comes down? The physical material washing down the river is just as critical to the restoration. Because the Elwha didn't just heal the mountains, it completely rebuilt the coastline.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where fluvial geomorphology, the study of how rivers shape the earth, becomes incredibly dramatic. We discussed sediment on the Klamath, but the Elwha provides a completed picture.
Right, because it's had a decade to settle.
Exactly. A healthy river operates as a continuous conveyor belt, transporting sediment from the eroding mountains down to the sea. The Elwha dams halted that conveyor belt for a century, trapping an estimated 20 to 24 million tons of sand, silt, cobble, and gravel in their reservoirs.
20 million tons of earth just sitting in the dark. And when the dams breached, all of it rushed down toward the Strait of Juan de Fuca. What happens when a century's worth of dirt hits the ocean all at once? I imagine coastal communities were terrified it would just choke the life out of the shoreline.
There was significant anxiety about the sediment plume, certainly. But the ocean handled it exactly as nature intended. For a century, the nearshore environment at the mouth of the Elwha had been violently starved of sediment.
So the beaches were just gone.
Pretty much. The coastal currents had eroded the beaches down to bare, heavy cobble. When the river finally delivered those 20 million tons of material, the coastal wave action went to work. It rapidly sorted the sediment by size, pushing the heavy gravel into new nearshore banks and sweeping the finer sands out to rebuild the beaches.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The shoreline literally expanded outward. The map of Washington state actually changed.
The geography expanded significantly. The river physically rebuilt its historic estuary and delta. And by replacing a harsh, eroded, high-energy cobble shoreline with broad, sandy beaches and complex gravel beds, the river resurrected the marine food web.
Because the sand brought the plants back.
Yes. The sandy substrates allowed for the rapid recolonization of eelgrass and kelp forests. Those underwater forests provided nursery grounds for Dungeness crab, clams, and massive schools of small forage fish like surf smelt and sand lance.
And those small forage fish are exactly what the returning adult salmon feed on before they enter the river. The river healed the ocean so the ocean could feed the river. It's perfectly cyclical.
It is a remarkable feedback loop.
And the Elwha proves that the rapid biological response we are seeing on the Klamath is not an anomaly. It is the guaranteed, scientifically proven response of an ecosystem when an artificial barrier is removed. We know with absolute empirical certainty what a river will do if we simply get out of its way.
Which forces us into the most difficult, complex phase of our analysis.
Yes, it does, because if the science is settled, if the biology is a known quantity, we have to ask why we haven't applied this knowledge everywhere. If we know exactly what a river will do when we let it heal, we have to look at the river we refuse to let answer.
The contrast is jarring, yes.
We have to pivot away from the victories of the Klamath and the Elwha, and we have to look at the lower Snake River.
The lower Snake River, located in eastern Washington state, represents perhaps the most intractable environmental conflict in the nation. The river is currently blocked by a series of 4 massive, federally owned and operated hydroelectric dams.
4 of them.
Yes. Moving upstream from the confluence of the Columbia River, you have Ice Harbor, completed in 1962, Lower Monumental, finished in 1969, Little Goose in 1970, and Lower Granite, completed in 1975. These structures are operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
And the existence of these 4 dams represents a colossal regional trade-off because they provide massive infrastructural benefits. The dams feature navigation locks that effectively transform a wild, free-flowing river into a 465-mile inland slack-water highway.
It completely changed the regional economy.
Right, because barges can load cargo in Lewiston, Idaho, which is somehow the most inland seaport in the western United States, and float it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They also generate significant hydroelectric power, but the cost of that infrastructure is paid entirely by the biology of the river.
Paid by the salmon.
Exactly. These dams stand like concrete fortresses directly blocking access to the finest, highest elevation, coldest, and most resilient salmon habitat left in the lower 48 states, the pristine headwaters of central Idaho.
The biological toll of that blockage cannot be overstated. The lower Snake River is the primary migration corridor for multiple distinct populations of anadromous fish, including Snake River spring and summer Chinook, fall Chinook, sockeye, and steelhead.
And they all have to get past 4 dams twice.
Yes. The cumulative stress of navigating past 4 massive dams as juveniles swimming to the ocean and then fighting past them again as returning adults proved devastating. By the early 1990s, the populations had collapsed so severely that they began to trigger emergency listings under the Federal Endangered Species Act.
But the federal government hasn't exactly ignored the problem, though, right? I mean, they have poured astronomical amounts of money into trying to fix the biology without removing the concrete.
Oh, the mitigation efforts have been staggering in their cost and scale. Over the last 30 years, regional ratepayers and federal agencies have spent billions of dollars attempting to engineer around the dams.
Billions?
Yes. They constructed massive, complex fish ladders to help adults swim past the turbines. They literally engineered fleets of specialized barges and trucks to collect juvenile salmon above the dams, drive them downstream, and release them below the final dam.
So they're literally driving the fish down the river.
Yes. They instituted complex spill programs, purposely flushing valuable water over the top of the dams rather than through the power-generating turbines to help flush the juveniles to the ocean safely. And they built massive hatchery programs to artificially prop up the numbers.
But the dossier data is brutally clear on this. Despite billions of dollars, despite fish ladders and barge fleets, the mitigation has failed to recover the wild populations. The runs remain critically depressed.
Dangerously low.
In some tributaries, the wild returns for specific runs have plummeted to just a few dozen adult fish. A few dozen. I mean, we spent the first half of this deep dive marveling at a sudden surge of 10,000 fish on the Klamath, and here we are looking at runs teetering on the absolute brink of functional extinction.
It is a dire situation.
And the people who have lived alongside these fish for thousands of years have spent decades fighting this decline.
The push to restore the Snake River is fundamentally anchored by tribal advocacy. The Nez Perce tribe, the Nimiipuu, along with their neighboring Columbia Basin Treaty tribes, the Yakima, the Umatilla, and the Warm Springs, have led the movement for dam breaching for over a generation.
And they have a massive legal foundation for this fight.
They do. Their advocacy is not merely a request for environmental conservation. It is rooted in supreme, binding legal authority.
The 1855 treaty. When you read the history of this conflict, every single argument eventually circles back to the treaty signed in 1855. What exactly does that document guarantee, and why does it carry such a massive legal weight today?
Well, in 1855, the Nez Perce entered into a treaty with the United States government. Under intense pressure, the tribe ceded millions of acres of their ancestral homeland to the expanding nation.
Millions of acres?
Right. However, the treaty was a negotiation, and in exchange for that vast territory, the Nez Perce explicitly reserved specific rights. Crucially, they reserved the inherent right to fish at, quote, all usual and accustomed places.
That phrasing is really important.
Very important, because under the United States Constitution, treaties are considered the supreme law of the land.
But a legally binding right to fish is entirely meaningless if the federal government operates infrastructure that ensures there are no fish left to catch.
Exactly the legal paradox. The oral histories and testimonies of tribal leaders continuously articulate the profound cultural, spiritual, and physical devastation caused by the loss of the salmon. For the Nimiipuu, the river and the salmon are not just resources, they are inextricably linked to their identity and their survival.
It's an existential threat.
It is. Armed with this treaty right, the tribes, frequently allied with the state of Oregon and various conservation groups represented by litigators like Earth Justice, took the federal government to court.
Over and over again.
For decades. They have challenged the federal operation plans for the dams, and time after time, across multiple presidential administrations, federal judges have ruled in favor of the tribes and conservationists, repeatedly determining that the current dam operations violate the Endangered Species Act and fail to protect the salmon from extinction.
So the legal victories are there. The biological science from the Klamath and the Elwha is there. So I have to ask you the hardest question in this entire deep dive. If the courts agree the dams are killing the fish, and the treaties demand the fish be protected, and the biology proves that removing dams brings the fish back, why did the concrete come down in California while the Snake River remains utterly deadlocked?
It is the pivotal question, and it requires us to separate the biology from the economics. We must be exceptionally careful not to draw a false equivalence here.
Right.
The fact that the Klamath dams were removed does not mathematically prove the Snake River dams will face the same fate. The engineering, economic, and political hurdles are vastly different. The fundamental divergences are scale, ownership, and grid integration.
Break that down for me. Let's start with the Klamath. Why was it economically viable to blow those dams up?
Well, the 4 Klamath dams were privately owned by a utility company, PacifiCorp. They were relatively small, aging facilities. When their federal operating licenses expired, the utility faced a choice. Spend hundreds of millions of dollars to retrofit the dams with mandatory modern fish passage technology, or surrender the licenses and remove the dams.
It was just a math problem for them.
Exactly. The financial math was stark. The retrofits would cost more than the dams were worth. Crucially, the power of those 4 dams generated was relatively minor, and the reservoirs did not support significant commercial navigation.
So no barges.
No barges. The dams were not load-bearing pillars of the regional economy. Their removal was ultimately a pragmatic business decision aligned with environmental goals.
It was cheaper for the private company to tear them down than to fix them. But the Snake River is entirely different infrastructure.
Completely different. The Snake River dams are colossal pieces of federal infrastructure. They are deeply woven into the fabric of the Pacific Northwest's energy and agricultural economy.
The scale is just massive.
It is. From a power perspective, they generate significant, dispatchable, carbon-free hydroelectricity. Dispatchable means the operators can instantly increase power generation to meet sudden spikes in regional energy, demand a critical function for grid reliability.
You can just flip a switch and get more power.
Right. Furthermore, the lock system on the lower Snake enables a massive, highly efficient barge shipping industry, Millions of tons of agricultural products, primarily wheat grown in the Palouse region of Washington and Idaho, are loaded onto barges and floated down to deep water ports on the coast for international export.
And moving bulk grain on a barge floating down a river requires significantly less fuel and produces far fewer carbon emissions than loading that same grain onto thousands of diesel trucks or rail cars.
That is the core economic complication.
Yeah.
Removing the Snake River dams is not just about blowing up concrete. It requires upending and completely replacing a massive integrated transportation and energy network. It is a fundamentally harder, much more expensive, and far more politically explosive proposition.
Which perfectly explains the absolute political whiplash we've witnessed at the federal level over the last 2 years. This decades-long biological crisis, gridlocked in federal court, suddenly collided with extreme partisan policy shifts. Let's look at the whipsaw between 2023 and 2025.
It was a very turbulent period. In late 2023, the decades of relentless litigation finally produced what appeared to be a landmark shift. On December 14, 2023, the Biden administration signed a comprehensive agreement with the Six Sovereigns, a coalition comprising the 4 Columbia Basin Treaty tribes and the states of Oregon and Washington.
The sheer financial scope of that agreement was historic, wasn't it?
Unprecedented. The federal government pledged over $1 billion over a 10-year period towards salmon recovery efforts and the development of tribally sponsored clean energy projects. In exchange, the tribes and the environmental plaintiffs agreed to a multi-year pause on the endless cycle of federal litigation.
A ceasefire, basically.
Yes. And symbolically, the agreement featured a formal, written acknowledgement from the United States government detailing the profound harm the construction and operation of the dams had inflicted on the tribes and the ecosystem.
But the critical caveat of the 2023 agreement was what it explicitly did not mandate. It did not order the removal of the dams.
That's right. The administration committed federal resources to study exactly how the transportation and energy services of the dams could be replaced, essentially building the economic blueprint for a post-dam future. But they deferred the ultimate decision to breach the dams to the United States Congress.
They punted.
They did.
Yeah.
Under federal law, because the Army Corps of Engineers built these specific structures, only an act of Congress has the legal authority to authorize their deconstruction. The executive branch admitted the severity of the problem, but punted the final structural solution to a divided legislature.
Which left the entire agreement incredibly vulnerable to political changes. And that vulnerability was exploited almost immediately. Just 18 months later, on June 12, 2025, the newly installed Trump administration issued a presidential memorandum that entirely revoked the 2023 agreement.
The 2025 revocation was swift and comprehensive. The administration withdrew federal support for the billion-dollar initiative, functionally dismantling the whole-of-government approach to salmon recovery in the basin.
Just wiped it out.
Yeah, the memorandum sent a definitive signal that the executive branch was prioritizing the existing infrastructure and was no longer considering dam removal as a viable federal option.
The fallout was immediate. Earth Justice and the tribal leadership strongly condemned the withdrawal. The fragile pause on litigation is now entirely uncertain, suggesting all parties will inevitably return to the grueling battleground of federal court. Meanwhile, the clock continues to tick down on the endangered salmon runs. So, what does this all mean?
It's complex.
If we are trying to understand the reality of the situation impartially, how does federal support for a collapsing ecosystem fluctuate so violently in such a short window?
To understand the deadlock, we must examine the situation with strict impartiality. This political whipsaw is not simply bureaucratic noise. It reflects a genuine, agonizing societal debate over competing values and massive infrastructural trade-offs.
Right.
The arguments on both sides of this divide are deeply entrenched and heavily consequential.
Let's lay those arguments out clearly without taking a side. What is the fundamental case made by the defenders of the dams?
The defenders, a coalition that includes river navigation advocates, regional agricultural interests, public utility groups, and numerous elected officials from the inland Northwest, argue that the dams are irreplaceable economic engines.
The power and the shipping.
Exactly. They point to the firm, dispatchable, carbon-free hydropower the dams generate, arguing this baseload power is absolutely essential to prevent rolling blackouts, especially as the region attempts to transition away from fossil fuels and as energy demand surges.
Because you can't just turn on the wind or the sun when you need more power immediately.
Right. Furthermore, they argue that the barge network remains the most efficient, cost-effective, and low-emission method to transport agricultural commodities to the global market. They assert that forcing that freight onto upgraded rail networks or highways would drastically increase transportation costs for farmers and spike regional carbon emissions.
Okay, so that's the infrastructural argument. And what is the core counter-argument from the critics pushing for removal?
The critics, led by the tribes, the state of Oregon, and a vast coalition of conservation scientists, countered that the actual power output of the 4 lower Snake River dams is relatively modest when viewed against the entire regional grid, and that it can be entirely and reliably replaced with a modern portfolio of solar, wind, and advanced battery storage technology.
So they're saying the grid can handle it if we build the alternatives.
Yes. They also point to data suggesting that bulk barge traffic on the river has actually been steadily declining for 2 decades, and they argue that strategic investments in regional rail infrastructure can efficiently handle the grain transport without collapsing the agricultural economy.
But the main point is the biology and the law, right?
But is their most profound argument? Yes, it is legal and biological. They assert that preserving the dams violates the supreme law of the land by functionally negating the 1855 treaty rights, and they point to the overwhelming scientific consensus that breaching the 4 lower dams is the single indispensable action required to prevent the total extinction of the Snake River salmon.
So we are left looking at 2 entirely divergent worldviews. One prioritizes the stability and economic efficiency of existing energy and transportation infrastructure. The other prioritizes the survival of an ancient ecosystem and the honoring of foundational legal treaties.
It's a clash of fundamental priorities.
But what strikes me after going through this massive dossier is that the science itself is no longer part of the debate. The biology of what would happen if the dams were removed is no longer a mystery.
This raises an important question. The rapid recovery on the Klamath, validated by the long-term data from the Elwha, has effectively removed the biological uncertainty from the equation. We know exactly how salmon respond to newly opened habitat.
We know they'll come back.
We do. We understand the precise mechanics of how a river flushes its sediment, rebuilds its chemistry, and restores its nearshore coastline when the concrete is removed. The science of river restoration is proven. The remaining barriers on the Snake River are entirely sociological, economic, and political.
Throughout this series of deep dives, we have documented an often bleak history regarding these rivers. We've seen decades of ignorance, bureaucratic indifference, and occasionally just pure greed dictate the management of these ecosystems. But standing where we are now analyzing this 2025 data, ignorance is no longer a valid excuse.
We have the data now.
We do. The Klamath and the Elwha have proven the biology beyond a shadow of a doubt. We know the river can heal itself. We know the ancient instincts of the fish are intact and waiting. But the ending to this story isn't tidy. We can't wrap this up with a bow and say everything is fixed, because the lesson of this series is only half learned.
It is, and I believe that leaves us with a necessary unresolved tension to consider. We've spent this hour discussing how the natural world responds to our actions. The rivers are clearly ready to answer. They have demonstrated exactly how rapidly they can heal.
But only if we let them.
Right. They can only provide that answer if society is willing to ask the right question. On the lower Snake River, the question is no longer, will the fish come back if we take the dams down? The Klamath proved they will.
Absolutely.
The question society is actually baiting now is entirely different. The question is, what comforts, what economic efficiencies, and what infrastructure are we willing to fundamentally change or live without to ensure that they do?
What are we willing to live without to ensure they do? That is the exact friction point. We started this deep dive by asking you to visualize standing on a riverbank, staring up at a towering wall of concrete that had choked a wild river for 60 years. We asked what happens when you finally have the will to tear that wall down.
And we saw the answer.
We did. On the Klamath River, nature answered in a matter of weeks. The barrier was removed, the water mixed, and an ancient genetic instinct took over immediately. But on the Snake River, the concrete is still there.
The wall remains intact.
It does. The debate rages on, and for now, the fish are still waiting. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep exploring these incredibly complex, deeply interconnected ecosystems on your own. Keep asking the hard questions, look critically at the infrastructure around you, and keep listening to what the rivers are trying to tell us.